I'm Bob McCormick, and when I'm in my car, I'm listening to 103.5 FM WNHH New Haven.
Bicycle, bicycle, bicycle. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride my bike.
You can ride your bike in the 12th annual Rock to Rock Bike Ride on Saturday, April 25th, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, while raising funds for more than 30 local environmental groups. You can ride across the city of New Haven or across the county in rides that are 5, 12, 20, 40, or 62 miles long. Experience the beauty of our parks, woods, and shoreline. Enjoy music and food at the Green Fair after the rides, and learn about the important work of participating groups. To register, visit rocktorock.org.
This is way more than ball spitting.
Good morning and welcome to WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines and the stories that make our community tick. Jesse Turner and Robert Goodrich are making New Haven tick. And they're working on making Connecticut tick for students in public schools. They're organizing a Walk for Equity next month up to Hartford to demand that our state do better for our children. And they're here in the WNHH studio to tell us about that. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to have you. Need familiar voices on these airwaves, and thanks to Young Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. So briefly for our listeners, April 3rd is the Walk for Equity is up to the state capitol for the Legislative Office Building press conference as well. Where does it start and what is it?
Okay. So the walk will start at Central Connecticut State University, and we're starting there not because I work there, but because that's the first teachers college in the state, and it's the 6th in the nation. So it's a good place to start for equity. It's a 12-mile walk to the Legislative Office Building.
What time are you starting?
We're going to start at 11. So Bishop Selder's, it won't be a large walking group because that's a long walk for some of our
It's a nice walk.
Yeah, it's a nice walk.
And it has a real tradition in social change, the idea of walking for change.
That's
Taken
right.
to the streets.
That's it. And the goal is that when we get to the Capitol building, we should arrive around 3:30, doing 15-minute miles. Kinds we've been practicing.
That's ambitious.
Yeah,
15-minute
we-
miles
we-
for the whole 12?
Well, we're going to try.
I'm a big
We've got-
walker, and I would have a little hard time with that.
We've been working. There's a group of
So
us
you're
working
working out,
Yes,
okay.
we're working on it. I've done 2 walks to D.C., 400-mile walks from Connecticut.
Wow.
2010, a walk for equity and against high stakes assessment, which has never delivered on equity in our history. And I did it again in 2015. So we'll walk to Connecticut for the press conference. We'll give a little time because we want teachers to come. At 4:30 will be the press conference. And at 4:30, we intend to put this state of Connecticut, the richest state in the nation, on notice that it can't be. We won't tax another billionaire. We're too afraid to do equity. We want equity. And we've got a Good Shepherd report card, and we're going to rate the Supreme Court decision in 2016 when they decided that Connecticut was not responsible to provide every student in
And
the state.
we're going to walk our listeners through every step
Sure,
in that
okay,
court
no problem.
decision, and that
All right.
sounds great.
All
I'm
right.
hoping we can maybe get a reporter with you on the walk.
Yeah, all right.
Someone who
we'd
can do that
love that.
15-minute mile. But
Yeah.
so it's just first and foremost, you're asking people to walk with you if they're up for it for 12
Yeah.
miles,
Right.
starting 11 o'clock, so you don't have to get up early. And from, let's see, Central Connecticut State is in
New Britain.
New Britain to Hartford. And then either way, parents, teachers, activists joining who want equity in our schools could
Right.
join you then at the state capitol for a press conference demanding equity in our schools.
Right.
What is equity?
All right. So equity is not spending the same amount per district. It's about giving the same class size that Darien and Avon have to Waterbury, to New Haven, to Meriden.
So it's about
to
how
Wyndham.
we equity
Yeah.
and how we fund our schools in Connecticut.
Yes, and we want them to rewrite the equity formula.
So
we
now
don't-
we have a formula for how we fund schools
Mhm.
in Connecticut. And I don't know if you'll find, we have 3.5 million people in Connecticut. Is that about right?
Roughly, yeah.
I don't think there's a single one who thinks the formula works, even if they disagree about everything else, right? Like,
There's consensus about that the formula.
so the
does
formula
not work.
does work.
Well,
So
it
the
doesn't-
question is what you do about it, right?
Right. I mean, it's clear that
I'm asking you close to the mic.
yeah, the formula for years has been operative. They haven't been funding it. So the formula, the ECS formula, doesn't work because they haven't funded it. There is
So
no
if
way
they
to.
fund it, it'd be okay.
Yeah, I mean,
ECS means educational cost sharing, meaning state money that goes to communities.
right.
To kind of make up for in bigger cities, we can't tax our property as much as wealthier communities can, and we can't end up, because of nonprofit, lower incomes and nonprofit ownership of property, we end up spending less in per student in in poor communities than they spend in wealthy communities, correct?
Correct. And what happens is we're unable to accurately measure the impact that funding levels have on school districts because there isn't consensus about what each school district should look like because of the different populations, income levels, and abilities of students.
So the two things I think I'm hearing from you folks is, first of all, we got to fund it and have a real fair system to have equitable schools, and we have to have a good way to judge what is equity, correct?
Correct. So
All right.
in terms of drawing out what equity looks like, we're looking for racial equity. We're not looking for equity in terms of one district to the next. We're looking for racial justice in our schools. And that means three things for me. And it means, one, eliminating the scientific, the predictable, disparate outcomes that students experience because of who they are. It's also removing the systemic structures that sort of lift or boost these disparities and keep them in place. And the third is removing the human barriers, which could be people, but also could be the way that individuals are treated as teachers or students in the school district.
So how would we go about doing that? If this march falls on receptive ears and things change, what do you want to see happen specifically?
So we decided to use the state's own SMART goals. So the state of Connecticut for priority school districts has placed their faith in saying that all priority schools must produce a 10% increase in test scores for the next 10 years.
So you'll use test scores as a measurement?
No,
Oh, okay.
we won't. What we're saying is we're going to do the same thing they're going to do. At our Good Shepherd report card, we're going to put the state on a SMART goals notice, and we're going to say we want a 10% improvement in equity over the next 10 years until you eliminate inequity in our state. And we're going to give that report card. It's not just this time. We will come back year after year after year.
So you've created a report card.
Right.
You call it the Good Shepherd report card. And the way that they do report cards for students and standardized tests to measure results, you're going to measure the state's results in getting rid of inequity in our school system, so statewide school system. So what kind of grades, what kind of measures are there on this?
So the first measure is the first institution we're going to give a failing grade to is the Connecticut State Supreme Court. They've already, I think Robert can venture to tell you that common through that decision.
I want to get the Supreme Court decision, but first what I'm asking you is when you put out this report every year,
sure,
what's it going to measure specifically?
We're gonna look for a less emphasis on test scores. We feel that we've got 40 years of that. Actually, we've got 100 years of using test scores to somehow improve equity. I've never seen it. If it had, we would know it by now. So that's one. The other will be on equity measures themselves. We want to see real equity, equitable service ratios. And the other is on the funding.
So on that first one, so what are tell me specifically what are those equity measures in that second category?
So give you an example. I have school districts now in New Britain that have no reading professionals.
So like how many reading professionals you have per kid?
Right.
Would it be class size? Would it be aides in the classroom? Would it be access to technology?
It will be aides in the classroom. It will be art teachers, music teachers, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, speech therapists.
Now, some of those needs are higher in concentrations of poverty. So you'll be looking for comparable numbers just to get that kind of progress, or you'll be looking for bigger numbers when there's a greater need.
So I think when we talk about racial equity, we're talking about transformation, not reform. So we're not trying to meet the standards of a school district in Lower Fairfield County that has higher or lower student per teacher ratios and greater amounts of school counselors and social workers. We're talking about having metrics that allow us to determine what a school in a Waterbury neighborhood or a New Haven neighborhood needs, and that they have access to not only just the funding, but the decision-making process that is driven by the community members to get the services that they feel their children and their students need. So that is a subjective analysis that has to happen. So when we talk about grading the ECS formula, it's so far disconnected from the community and parents and students' needs that there's just no way to accurately reflect what it is that funding means to Fairhaven School or North End Middle School in Waterbury.
And Jesse Turner, you said there was a third category before I interrupted you.
Yeah, so the third category was we want to see increases in funding to priority school districts. We don't want to see states beating them up. We don't want to see the Hartford Courant printing a list of shame. What we want to see is a state that says if 45% of our students are struggling in test scores that are supposed to be so important, we want to see the army of tutors that are in our schools. We don't want to see school boards taken over, like in Hartford, by mayors make decisions. If democracy is good in Darien and Avon, then democracy is good in Hartford, Windham, Meriden, New Haven. So we're tired of those things where democracy is taken over. You know, that's one component of it. But really, we want to end the beating up of priority schools over test scores. We want to see real equity goals in the state. And we want to see, and we're going to know that by seeing, have you increased funding 10% to our priority school years over the next 10 years? If you can do that, I think we'll see a transformation. That's why Robert and I will not use the word school reform. School reform has failed this nation in our public school system for 170 years. The first school reforms happened 170 years ago. You know, this is not new, and it's always we're going to fix the teachers and we're going to have a more rigorous test. And I'm still waiting for that reform to work.
But in the meantime, you're organizing a march for equity statewide for people who want transformation of how we support our schools in Connecticut, help them succeed. And two gentlemen are on WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven right now telling us all about that. Their names are Jesse Turner and Robert Goodrich. You're 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. connecticut.org. So now let's get to that court case that started this all. The Connecticut Coalition for Justice and Education Funding. That was a group that said that it's really sick the way we fund our schools, that rich schools are getting more than poor schools, against Rel, who was the governor then. 13 years that case went through the courts. Got a dramatic, groundbreaking decision from a Superior Court judge who ordered the state to immediately change how they funded schools. When they saw Westport getting money at the expense of Bridgeport schools in the state budget, that judge just lost it and said, got to change it. And then the state government rallied against that. The political leaders like Daniel P. Malloy, as well as the state legislators saying, this is not for the courts to tell us. And then they prevailed. In January 2018, the state Supreme Court said, we all agree it's broken. We all agree it's wrong how it's done. But the state Supreme Court said, this is an issue for the legislature, not for the courts. Which, American history is much different if that's what they said about civil rights in the 50s and 60s. If the court said it's not a constitutional matter of some of our basic principles in government. It's let the states decide. But they're saying let the state government decide here. What was your reaction to that ruling, and how have you since regrouped?
Well, externally, not being a part of the case, but also following it, and as Judge Mukwasher delivered his opinion in the court case, there was one word that stood out, and this lets me comment a little bit more about the Supreme Court's decision to deny what he ordered to be done, is that he mentioned the word idiosyncratic, that there is no justification for the ways in which schools are funded in the Connecticut currently. Therefore, it's incumbent to make significant changes or reforms. So, of course, the state's going to appeal that because it's going to cost them hundreds of millions of dollars to fully fund the ECS formula or attempt to fund our schools equitably. So, in an abolition tradition, what I would say what was needed is that a whole new idea needed to be created while they worked on upgrading and increasing the amount of funding and ultimately replace the ECS formula. So procedurally, the Supreme Court says that we need to uphold the institutions that are required to govern, legislate, and regulate how schools are funded. Now, that's dependent upon a Eurocentric white supremacist viewpoint that the institutions that control the power or have the power now should be allowed to reform themselves. And that, in fact, is what is most problematic about the Supreme Court decision to hand back what it was essentially an ineffective group of people doing this work for almost 2 decades. And they didn't have the political will or the courage to make the difficult decisions. So why, in fact, should we as a community accept that they're going to go back and make decisions in good faith to equitably fund our schools? So very, very problematic.
Has it happened in the 2 years?
An increase in funding?
Have they made the right decisions when the judge said it's up to the Supreme Court said the legislature can fix it?
So I can provide you specific examples like I did this morning when it talks about even within school districts. If I talk about 2 schools in Waterbury, one's Waterbury Career Academy, which is the top performing school in our district in Waterbury, has one of the highest graduation rates in the state of any urban high school. Wilby High School is the exact opposite. It's one of the lowest performing schools in the state and in Waterbury. Waterbury is allowed, based on approval from the State Department of Education, which is regulated by our legislature about the powers that they have, has chosen to use more Alliance District funding per pupil at Waterbury Career Academy.
Alliance is supposed to help struggling schools.
And yes, and a significantly less amount per pupil at Wilby High School. Now, when we talk about comparing Waterbury to Darien, it's probably not a good starting point. We need to take a look at intra-district funding comparisons. And currently, one of the problems is that school districts are not required by the state legislature to report about how they're funding individual schools. Now, in New Haven, there's been some movement by advocates and activists and parents
for equity within the district.
Right, but the starting point is knowing what they're spending per school, per program, per student. And that should be revealed to every parent and every student on an everyday basis.
Jesse Turner, how did you feel in January 2018 after a 13-year court fight that saw that amazing Superior Court decision demanding change? How did you feel when the case lost at the state Supreme Court?
A bit broken on that day. I had waited for that decision to come down. a bit broken by a Democratic governor who made appointments to a Supreme Court, a Democratic governor who, when he was a mayor, supported that decision, for the Rel decision. I was hopeful that we would have a victory on that day, on that April. There's a reason we're picking April 3rd.
And that was the question, Bob McCormick. Thanks for listening. Said, when is the welcome where? We did say this earlier, but we'll repeat it. April 3rd, starting at Central Connecticut State University, 11 a.m.
Right.
A walk to Hartford that ends at 4:30 p.m., where everybody else who might not have walked is asked to gather for a press conference at the Legislative Office building.
Right. And so in 2018, on April 4th, outside the Supreme Court House, I was there with Moral Mondays when we made our annual appeal for a moral budget, and we put that Supreme Court decision front and center on that day, because that was the day that we felt the state of Connecticut had betrayed every black and brown and special education and poor child in this state. And I'm very cognizant of that. That judge did say one thing. He said, this is not a court remedy situation. This is a legislative situation. And for 2 years, I have watched the legislature not step up.
So now you regrouped. You went from disappointment to organizing. Don't
That's
mourn,
right.
organize, the famous phrase. So you organized by creating this group to do a march and push for more. Correct? Now you're reaching out to radical educators, parents, and activists. This past weekend, you made the pitch at the People Get Ready bookstore on Whaley.
Yes.
How'd that go? Who showed up, and what was the pitch?
The pitch was there are a group of Connecticut radical educators who have been fighting this battle for a long time. And we got together. So Lauren Anderson is a co-partner in the People Get Ready bookstore. And we met with her, Dr. Shelley Jones, who's just finished her new book, Women Who Count, about black female mathematicians. Rose Rios from Wyndham. A number of teachers and parents met there. And we talked about this situation, and we needed to do something. And we're taking that, as Robbie said, we are the new abolitionists. We're the ones that are saying slavery's over. We're going to end it. We're going to do whatever it takes. And what we're saying now is inequity is over. Connecticut, we have given you enough time. We have waited long enough. It's like Dr. King in a letter from a Birmingham jail when 7 prominent clergy members wrote a public newsletter telling him he should wait and he should not be arrested for nonviolence and standing up to injustice. He should be patient. And Dr. King said 350 years has been long enough to wait. And we're saying right now 170 years in Connecticut is enough time.
All right. So you're doing the Good Shepherd report card as well. And let me ask you how you got involved in all this. So, Jesse, you were a public school teacher for how many years?
17 years.
Where?
In New Jersey and Arizona.
And then you became a professor at Central Connecticut State University.
Yes.
And you still are?
Still are, yeah.
And what do you teach there?
I'm a professor of literacy, elementary and early childhood education, and I'm the director of our literacy center, which provides about $200,000 worth of free tutoring to children from the surrounding community every year.
How did you go from being a teacher/professor to activist for educational equity?
Well, one, I'm going to say that I've always been an activist. So in 1963, when Martin spoke, I was 8 years old. I was there with my grandfather. I was on his shoulders. I don't remember much of the day. I wasn't cognizant. I did know that soon as Dr. King spoke, I was taken off the ground and put on his shoulders. That's what I remember. So I tell people I was an activist before I was an educator. And I marched for too many things. For peace, when they laid off the air traffic controllers, I was in D.C. for that one.
Patco in 1981, Ronald Reagan changed the course of the labor movement in America.
So this is what I always do. But I usually tell people I'd rather just teach what I love. Last night at the end with my teachers in the literacy center, their kids were leaving, and one little 3rd grade girl came and said, "Dr. Turner, look at this, and it's a whiteboard with 3 little hearts, and it says, Dr. Turner is the best. That's what I live for. I don't live for marching, walking 400 miles to D.C. I don't want to go to the Connecticut State House to tell them to do what they're supposed to do.
Sometimes you don't get to choose when history calls.
That's right.
And Robert Goodrich, how did history call you? You have a group called Radical Advocates for Cross-Cultural Education, RACCE. You said 3 years a teacher in Waterbury?
So, yes, my life path is a little bit different than Dr. Turner's.
Again, I'm going to ask you to get real close to the mic.
Yep. So my life path is a little different to Dr. Turner's. I came from the corporate world and went back to school in my 30s And that's when
What were you doing in the corporate world?
I was sales and marketing. I worked for a variety of organizations. One of those was Icon or A-Copy here in Connecticut. Then I worked for an orthopedic organization selling hip and knee replacements and fracture management devices in New York City for Smith and Nephew. And then I slowly came back to the idea that I need to get involved in education and follow my father's path, who was a Danbury High School teacher for 35 years. And then I started working within the field of debate and argumentation, coaching and teaching debate to college students. And then I came back to Waterbury and found myself working in the Waterbury Public Schools. And that's where I found that sort of the theories that I had been investigating through my education were actually living out in the experiences of my students. And therefore, as an employee, started advocating for change in the Waterbury Public Schools.
And then does the organization have enough money that you could do this as your job?
So that's one of the things that's really important to acknowledge, is that fighting for racial justice in our schools is a difficult field to be in and to be paid what it is required to live off of. So RACE does a mixture of work, working with school districts and teachers and motivated individuals, but we also go out there and look for opportunities to be funded by philanthropic entities to increase our ability to organize community members around racial justice in our schools, in the Waterbury Public Schools. So we do it two ways. We do private consultation and training and coaching, and then we also seek out grant funding from different philanthropic entities.
Equity and racial justice in Connecticut schools. We're going on the march for it, April 3rd, starting out New Britain, ending up at the Capitol. We heard all about that today from Jesse Turner and Rob Goodrich. How do people get involved, folks, if they want to join this movement, join this march?
The easiest way is to send an email to me, turnerj@ccsu.edu. That's the easiest way. But you can also find me on Facebook. I'm public. I do this work. My family sometimes get mad because I'm always talking about education. I'm saying this is who I am. You can find me on Facebook. I also have a blog, Children Are More Than Test Scores, and I blog about these issues all the time. You know, for the past 6 weeks, I've been caught up in the work going to Selma for the Selma Jubilee at the Education Summit. But I'm ready. This weekend I'll be talking about this march and this action. So I'll be blogging about that, and you can find me, just Google.
And Robert Goodrich, they could find you at race.net,
Yeah,
RACC.
you can go right to our website, racce.net.
All right. Well, I wish you luck, and we invite everybody to join the march for racial justice and equity in our schools. Thanks for joining us today on WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. Thanks to our guests, Jesse Turner, Robert Goodrich, and thanks to the miracle man behind the controls, WNHH station manager, Harry Dross. I want to also thank Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long on WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.